Good afternoon, attendees of this colloquium. I am Abigail Payne, the Ronald Henderson Professor and Director of the Melbourne Institute, Applied Economic and Social Research in the Faculty of Business and Economics. Let me extend a warm welcome to each and every one of you. Let me also acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. These colloquia provide insights through the lens of Melbourne Institute researchers and to engage with you so we can better understand Australian economic and social policy. Today, I am thrilled that Professor Roger Wilkins is joining us to present insights from the 2020 HILDA Survey Statistical Report. This report was released on November 20th. If you have not had a chance to read this report, please see your chat function for a link to the report. Roger, who serves as Deputy Director of the HILDA Survey, as well as the Deputy Director of the Melbourne Institute, has been leading the analysis and production for the annual survey report for 13 years. After Roger's presentation, he will answer your questions to allow us to engage in a fuller discussion of the findings from this year's statistical report. Please let me remind you of a few housekeeping matters for this colloquium. This is being recorded. To handle questions and comments, we are relying on the Q&A function found at the bottom of the screen for those of you using Zoom. For those of you using Slido, you can submit questions in the box on the right-hand side of your screen. Please submit questions at any time through these functions. And now, please join me in welcoming Roger.
Thanks, Abigail. Now let me just share my screen. Okay, hopefully that's all working. So obviously the HILDA Statistical Report, for those of you aware of it, is quite big, quite wide-ranging. So I won't be able to, I'll have to present obviously just a fairly narrow selection of the findings. What I'll focus on primarily, I think, is the economic well-being, how that's been faring, and I guess with an emphasis on things that we might not know were it not for HILDA.
I'm not sure I understand.
Sorry. So and I guess looking at the implications, of these findings for where we are now and for looking forward. Before I start, I'd like to make some acknowledgements. So firstly, the funder, the Australian Government Department of Social Services, who fund not only the study, but also this report. This year's report has 4 authors, so I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Ferdy Botha, Esperanza Vera Toscano, and Mark Warden. And I'd also acknowledge Emily Redmond for overseeing the design of the report, and also the many people involved in producing the data that this report analyses. So there's the Melbourne Institute HILDA Survey team, the fieldwork provider Roy Morgan, and the approximately 32,000 people who have at some stage responded to the HILDA survey between 2001 and 2018. Before I get into the findings, I thought it might be useful just to give a little bit of background on what the HILDA survey is and I guess what it's not. So it's a longitudinal household study that started in 2001. We started with 13,969 respondents in 2001. We now currently annually interview about 17,500 respondents. That's largely because in 2011 we had a general sample top-up, which was primarily motivated by a desire to address underrepresentation of immigrants who'd arrived since 2001. The study is designed to be indefinitely lived, so we follow the original sample members and give them the HILDA gene, and they pass that on to their children. So we interview their children and their children's children, and so on. We also add people who have a child with an existing sample member. It's designed to be nationally representative, and it's broadly does maintain that. We have fairly low attrition of less than 4% of people are lost each year who responded in the previous year. But the challenge for us mostly is that immigrants arriving since 2011 are underrepresented. It's become, well, it is something of an omnibus survey, but annually it collects data on income, spending, employment, health, education, family relationships, and many other topics. And we also have a considerable amount of data that's collected periodically, usually every 4 years, and that includes things like wealth, additional health information, retirement, fertility intentions, human capital, and so on. So what does HILDA offer compared with other data sources? Well, it's the only one that has all three of, a rich array of information on a number of aspects of life for each respondent. We have the household context, so we interview everyone aged 15 and over, and we also collect information for on children, some information at least on children aged under 15, and it's longitudinal. So we're the only one that has all three of these properties. So there's been a good development in recent years is increasing availability and use of administrative data, which still got a long way to go. But to think of that as making something like HILDA redundant would be misplaced, or would not be a correct view, because while they are often longitudinal, things like tax records data, and they have in principle the whole population. They tend to be have relatively limited information in them. So they don't have information, for example, in the tax records on health and relationships and well-being and all sorts of other things. So they tend to be a bit narrow, and there's all sorts of linkages that you can look at with HILDA data that you couldn't do with those administrative sources. About this report, so this is the 17th report in the series. I've been involved in 14 of them, so I've been doing this a while. The first one was in 2007, covering waves 1 to 3. This one covers waves 1 to 18, so from 2001 to 2018. And just if you're wondering what's happened to 2019, well, that data is coming out later this month, and so the report for waves 1 to 19 will come out next year, hopefully a bit earlier than the report came out this year. And then release 20, which has data that's been collected during the pandemic this year, and in fact we're still collecting data for this 20th wave, and that's due for release in December next year. The content of the report, well, the report has evolved a bit over time, but in recent years it's been a fairly stable structure where there are 3 substantial chapters on households and family life, economic wellbeing, and the labour market. And that largely reflects, I guess, the core focus of the study, at least as it was originally conceived. And then 6 to 10 shorter chapters on specific topics, and that they're often influenced by the so-called rotating content administered in the most recent wave. It's intended to be wide and shallow rather than narrow and deep. So it's trying to give us a general sense of what the data are telling us about Australia, and trying to communicate the enormous potential of the data set. So it's very much about promoting others to undertake their own analyses. So the report is not the HILDA study. Really the main product of the HILDA study is the data set. And in that context, it's worth noting that there's been over 1,200 journal articles published using the data, hundreds of other publications. And hopefully the data has been heavily analysed within government departments and agencies to inform their policy development. There's usually at least 2 authors, and as I mentioned, there are 4 for this year's report. The content of this year's report, I've got the table of contents listed there on the right side of the screen. We have, and then on the left side, I've just given a little bit more detail there about the content of the 3 substantial chapters. So for households and family life, there's some examination of shared care arrangements and relationship breakdown. In household economic well-being, there's some analysis of material deprivation, which is an alternative way of looking at poverty, and also an examination of alternative measures of the size of the middle class in Australia. For the labour market section, there's analysis of job separations, distance between home and place of work, looking at employees apparently earning less than the national minimum wage, and an examination of the characteristics of people most exposed to the economic effects of COVID-19. So I'm going to highlight some of the findings from chapters 3, 4, so the economic well-being, the labour market, 7, this chapter on life satisfaction, and chapter 8, which looks at the distribution, composition and dynamics of household wealth. But I'm probably being going to be too ambitious, and I'm going to throw probably too many numbers at you. But I find it extremely hard to choose between what to show you. So I'm erring on the side of showing you too much, I guess. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is what HILDA is saying about household income levels and inequality. And I've got it here for 2 different measures of income, or 2 different time frames. So I've got income measured over 1 year, but also taking advantage of the longitudinal structure, looking at what's happening to income measured over 5 years. So this is a sort of a longer term measure of your economic well-being as captured by income. And the blue line is a measure of the average level of income, it's the median, and then the orange line is a measure of inequality, it's the Gini coefficient. So higher orange line translates to higher inequality. So looking at the left-hand panel first, we see that average income growth was very strong up to 2009, but it's been, I guess you'd say, pretty disappointing since then. We have, there's always a glass half full, glass half empty interpretation of what's happened since 2009. I mean, you can say that we've hung on to the enormous income gains that we achieved in the first 9 odd years of this century, but I think most have been hoping that we would be able to sustain some continued growth in household incomes in real terms post the mining boom and the GFC. Inequality, there's no real clear trend there. It moves around a bit from year to year, but there's no sort of trend, fall or rise in inequality. While there was some disagreement with the ABS data in the early 2000s, particularly between 2004 and 2008, since 2008, they've both been telling a very similar story about what's been happening to overall income inequality. So when you look at income measured over 5 years, well, the median income, unsurprisingly, sort of shows a similar sort of trend, and that 5-year income peaked in around the 2010 to 2014 period. But you find that measured inequality, I've got it on the same scale there, and it's considerably lower, and that just reflects the fact that people move up and down the income distribution from 1 year to the next. You have a good year, you have a bad year, and so what you find is that when you look at income over a longer time frame, it's less unequally distributed. So it's an important, I think, insight from the data of just how much difference it makes, the time frame over which you measure income. I think the other interesting thing from this is that this inequality of 5-year income, though, did shift up until around the 2007 to 2011 period. So what that suggests is that income mobility declined somewhat. Now, I wouldn't want to overstate it because it's not a huge increase, but it does mean that there was a growth and tendency for the rich to stay rich and the poor to stay poor. But as I said, it's a fairly slight increase, but it has gone up and maintained at that higher level. So focusing on the lower end of the income distribution, here I'm talking about what's called income poverty. So what HILDA is showing here, and this is where we define poverty as having an income, an equivalized income, which is an income adjusted for household size, that's less than half the median equivalized income. That's given there by the blue line. So that was that over the century as a whole, that has been trending downwards. The orange line is what we call an anchored poverty line, and that's where that's looking at the proportion of people that are below the 2001 poverty line. So what we're saying is that the dollar value, at least in real terms, of income you need to be out of poverty is being held constant, and so that declines more sharply, reflecting the growth in median income that we have seen over the century as a whole. But I think so. This is sort of telling, over broadly speaking, a story of progress, but also there's been something of an uptick in both measures of poverty towards the end of the period. So that is, I guess, some cause for concern, particularly, I guess, thinking about what's happened this year. If there was, we already were starting to see a bit of a trend rise in poverty even before the developments of this year. And one particularly striking finding was that the poverty rate for single parent families went up quite substantially, from 15% in 2016 to 25% in 2018, and raising I guess some cause for alarm, and certainly something we'd want to be keeping an eye on and thinking about. The other thing that now sort of drawing again on the longitudinal information is to look at the extent of poverty persistence, or how entrenched poverty is. Now, there's multiple different ways of looking at this, and I've just got one approach to presenting that here. And here I'm just looking at working age, people who are working age for a full 10-year period, and how many, looking at the distribution of the number of years they are in poverty in that 10-year period. So, for example, we can see here that for men aged 18 to 55 in 2001, 73.1% were never in poverty in the 10 years to 2010. And then if we look at the most recent decade of HILDA, so that's 2009 to 2018, we see 75.5% were never in poverty. So for both men and women, we're reflecting the cross-sectional poverty rates. We've seen a decline, an increase in proportion of people who never experience poverty, and we have seen some decline in very entrenched poverty. So for men, it's gone from 2.5%. Being in poverty 7 or more of the 10 years down to 1.8%. For women, it's gone from 3.1% to 1.8%. Again, though, with that uptick in poverty in the last few years, and with possible developments, going forward over the next few years, that decline in entrenched poverty is at risk, I guess, of being reversed. That trend. Right, so now I'll just talk a bit briefly about income support receipt, and this, in some ways sort of mirrors what's been happening to poverty, except that we see that even that the trend decline in receipt of income support, so things like job seeker and the disability support pension, parenting payment, but that's continued to decline up to 2018. Obviously, this year we're going to see a big reversal of that trend. We may well see these two lines shoot up to higher than their 2002 levels, would be my guess. So we've gone, but up to 2018, we've gone from about 25% to about 17% personally receiving income support at some stage of the year, and then we've gone from just under 40% of people having someone in their household receive income support to just under 30%. And an analogous to what we did with poverty is looking at working age people's receipt of income support over a 10-year period. And I think the thing that really strikes me most about this is how much contact there is with the income support system in Australia. Now, it has declined. So comparing the first decade of HILDA with the last decade of HILDA, noting that there's 2 years overlap in those 2 decades, there has been an increase in the proportion having no contact. But even still, in that decade to 2018, 42.8% of men had no contact, which means that the corollary of that is 57.2% had some contact with the income support system over that 10-year period. And similarly, 59.6% of women had some contact with the income support system over that period. So, so the income support system has remained a really significant feature of the of Australian society, and as really obviously plays an important safety net role for many people. So there's very few people who, there's sort of 9 to 11% of people who are consistently on income support over the period, but so there's but there's a lot who have brief contact with the system. On household wealth, so in 2018, it was the fifth time we collected data on household wealth. So we first collected it in 2002. Over the period as a whole, we've seen quite strong growth in real terms in the in mean household wealth and median household wealth. Although interestingly, between 2006 and 2010, and between 2010 and 2014, mean wealth actually decreased. Perhaps somewhat surprisingly, HILDA's not showing any discernible, or significant change in inequality of wealth. But what it is showing is, I guess you could call it an increased age gradient in wealth. So the differences between older and younger people in their mean wealth has grown over the period. So it's like we sometimes refer to as an intergenerational divide in wealth. I think interesting is that changes to the composition of household wealth over the period. So we've seen a rise in the importance of property or housing and superannuation, and a decline in direct holding of equities, shares, and business ownership. And I think we've gone from, in 2006 we had about 13% of people owning businesses to under 10% in 2018. So that sort of does perhaps raise some questions about some sort of decline in entrepreneurialism, or just maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but I think it's an interesting result. And then the final thing I just want to briefly mention on wealth is that the usual statistics that get quoted on home ownership, I think, give us a bit of a misleading perception of the extent of home ownership in this country. So, we tend to get sort of the figure of around 2/3 of people are in owner-occupied housing, which is sort of broadly true. But there's a lot of people living in owner-occupied housing who don't own that home, and in particular, we have a lot of young adults who are living with their parents, often because they can't afford to buy a house, or they're trying to get in. And so, we're really closer to sort of 50% of adults actually owning the home in which they live. Somewhat, but one thing that's notable is that we did see a slight uptick in home ownership between 2014 and 2018. Now, I guess this is, there's been quite a bit of discussion this year about people adversely impacted by the economic shutdown and the recession more broadly this year. And there's been talk about women and young people being disproportionately affected, in terms of their employment and so forth, which is true. But I thought it'd be useful to use the household information in HILDA to look at an alternative way of thinking about exposure to the shutdown. That was to look at people who lived in a household where the main income earner worked in one of the 19 two-digit industries that experienced a greater than 15% decline in employment between February and May of this year. So when you look at people who were in these exposed households, where their income was coming from these, mostly coming from these industries that have contracted considerably, you get a more even gender and age mix than you do when you just look at who's actually employed in those industries. And even on family type as well, you get a more even mix. I think what comes out though from this that's also more striking is that that on things like in terms of their economic circumstances and also in terms of their health and disability, there are somewhat more disadvantaged groups. They have lower incomes, lower home ownership rates, lower wealth, higher poverty rates, and so forth. And they're also tend to be in poorer health. So I think that's quite instructive on just who's sort of being most vulnerable to what's been happening this year. I am conscious that I am going to run over time, so I think I will skip through talking about what's been happening to earnings and employment, and focus on what we observed in the last economic downturn, so the global financial crisis, where what happened to job separations. I think what's interesting is, with the onset of the GFC, we did see a rise in people made redundant or otherwise dismissed. But what we saw an even bigger change in was the proportion of people who quit their jobs for job-related reasons. So that's usually because you've got another job or to take another job. So that declined dramatically at the time of the GFC, and has only slowly edged back up, and it's certainly nowhere near its pre-GFC level. So this translates to a decline in job mobility, and I would expect that that's going to take a big dive this year. And if this history is repeated, that does have important implications for the efficient operation of the labour market going forward. We'd see a deterioration in the quality of matching between workers and jobs, and it's also a mechanism by which it can slow wage growth. Because one really very important way, or one common way to increase your wage, one of the best ways to increase your wage is to change jobs. But of course, I also expect the blue line to jump up dramatically, and certainly more dramatically than we saw in the GFC. The final thing I want to just highlight is that we measure subjective well-being in the HILDA study every year, and particularly there's a question about your overall life satisfaction, where you pick a number between 0 to 10, where 0 means totally dissatisfied and 10 means you are totally satisfied. And there was an analysis this year by 30 of the determinants of life satisfaction. So this is what we call a fixed effects regression model. But basically, if you're looking at, for example, and I've picked out things that are, I guess, seem particularly pertinent to this year. So, for example, frequency of social contact comes out as a really important predictor of your life satisfaction. So if and we know that social contact has taken a big hit this year, and to interpret that for females, having social contact every day versus less than monthly increases your life satisfaction on average by 0.229 on that 0 to 10 scale. And just to give a sense of how big that is, if you look at the effect of household income, that's gone up, that each $10,000 increases your life satisfaction by 0.01. So that 0.229 translates to about $230,000 in equivalised income. Active participation in sporting and community clubs, that's also taken a hit this year. And of course, employment has taken a hit. And these are all quite large effects that we're finding here for what determines your life satisfaction. So safe to say, if you had any doubt, it's that we're as a community probably considerably less happy this year than last year. So some takeaways. So I think while Australia wasn't travelling too badly on a lot of respects, Australia was tracking reasonably well up to 2018, but we did enter this recession with some concerning trends underway. Poverty rates were starting to edge up, and also what I didn't show is that for males, their full-time employment rates have they took a big hit after the GFC, and they just haven't recovered at all since then. Those most exposed to the economic shutdown, they were relatively disadvantaged to begin with, and they're more. It's more distributed across across gender and age than perhaps we might have thought from other commentary and other statistics that have been shown in this regard. I think another big takeaway is that the welfare system now is playing a bigger role in economically supporting people than it has for many years. And in fact, I've just got a graph there from administrative data on the number of recipients of job seeker and youth allowance other, so unemployment benefits. You can see it's went up to 1.6 million from 800,000 very quickly. But allowance receipt, without the coronavirus supplement, almost destined to put you in poverty. So I have no doubt that line will come down a lot more slowly than it went up. There's already sort of early indications that is the case. So we're looking at much of 2021 with considerably more people on income support payments on this allowance rate, and if that then puts those people in poverty, if we go back to the regular allowance rate, then we're looking at a lot more people in poverty in 2021 and possibly for some time after that. For single parent families, I think what HILDA's showing does raise, there seems to be a lot of high rate of poverty amongst this group, a high proportion struggling. Is this issue getting enough attention? The age gradient of wealth is steepened. Are we looking at younger generations? Are they going to achieve the same levels of wealth that the older generations currently have? Eventually, remains to be seen, but certainly their lower home ownership rates would be a cause for pessimism on that front. I didn't show the results, but there was closing of the gender gap in both full-time employment and wages in the last few years of HILDA, and there's an open question of to what extent COVID will derail this progress. And as I mentioned, subjective well-being is likely taking a big hit this year. So with that, I will finish up, and I just.
Okay, great. Thank you, Roger. That was very ambitious, and you did a fantastic job of giving us, important highlights of the survey this year. So let's move to your questions. Again, let me remind you, if you're on Zoom, there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And if you're on Slido, there's a function on the right-hand side of your screen. So first question is, a question I know that often gets asked, but a lot of people may not know the answer, is why are we not joining up HILDA with administrative data collections to get the best of both worlds?
Yes, that's definitely something that has been extensively discussed amongst us and DSS and others. And look, there are moves afoot in that regard. Obviously, there are issues in terms of we do worry about how respondents might react. We certainly need to get their consent to do such linkage, and there is the concern that that may discourage participation in the study if people feel like the government sort of has this information combined with the administrative records. Those are the sorts of concerns. But we are there are some plans to particularly link to Centrelink records, but but yeah, we're taking cautious steps, would be what I'd say there.
Yes. Okay, great. Thank you. Let's, on one of your last points, you mentioned single parent families and whether or not the current pandemic is basically making it an increasing crisis that may not be getting enough attention. And there's concern that if government policy reduces or eliminates the coronavirus supplement, this could again affect this particular group of households even more. And so the question is, do you have any thoughts on what should be done from a policy framework?
Yeah, I mean, this has been, from a researcher's point of view, a really interesting year in the sense that, the increased government income support this year, particularly in the form of the coronavirus supplement, has probably had a profound effect on reducing poverty and disadvantage throughout much of this year. And then it, of course, raises the question: well, why only just this year? Can we, longer term, support people better, with the income support system who need it, and obviously the concerns arise around fiscal cost and disincentives to work and the like. But I think the move to put single parents on what's now the job seeker rate from when the youngest is 8 years of age, I think that's not been. I think that was ill-advised, and I think there has been some tightening up or some just gradual chipping away at family tax benefit generosity, and so there's I think some potential for increasing the generosity of that, at least for lower income people. But I think the the outlook for next year is, particularly if they completely eliminate the coronavirus supplement, is for even further prevalence of disadvantage amongst single parents. And I did see in the analysis that I skated through, single parent families were more exposed to the industries that were shut down, and to some extent, to a significant extent, they still are. Hospitality and arts and recreation in most states are still quite restricted, and so employment's still going to be much lower than pre-COVID in those industries, and single parent families were more exposed to those industries. So, but I looked at the policy response to me is, I'm being a bit simplistic, but just give them some more money for those who are on benefits. But childcare is another avenue that can help facilitate, perhaps universal or free childcare can improve their ability to participate in employment. I mean, what's really interesting about HILDA this year is that despite this was the first year when we had the new childcare subsidy, which ostensibly should have increased the subsidy to lower income families. So should have lowered the cost of childcare, but we actually saw a decline in use of childcare amongst single parents in HILDA. And so I'm a little bit mystified by that. And it certainly, I think, needs some further probing.
Okay, great. On your graphs where you're looking at income support, what I'm going to phrase the persistence of income support. I noticed that with respect to the number of years on which for males and females on income support, so if you the number of years of 5 or more years, there seems to be an increase in that persistence by men and a decrease in that persistence by women over time. And so I hate to put you on the spot, but do you have any conjectures or any insights as to why we're seeing a difference in those in the persistence rates?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, I don't really know. I mean, obviously I talked about the decline in full-time employment for men. So that may be part of the story that, I mean, this is still true today, that women have higher rates of income support receipt than men, largely because they're more likely to be single parents. If you look at men and women without, who are single without children, they have pretty similar rates of income support receipt. But I guess it's going to be partly a story about relative deterioration in the labour market for men. Would be my guess, but yeah, I'd certainly be interested to hear what others made of that result, because obviously I haven't looked into what could be driving that.
Okay, great. And then when you were looking at assets and debt, I know pre-pandemic in other countries, there's been a lot of concern about increasing credit card debt and unsecured debt. And what I notice in your slide is that it appears as though credit card debt has declined for Australians. So do you have any commentary on that?
Well, it's got to be a good thing, doesn't it? I mean, and I think, look, I don't know quite what to make of it. I mean, it's not, household debt overall is more than doubled in real terms. But in that context, it sounds to me that it says something good about our financial markets, that people are able to, the debt that they need, they're able to get at more cheaply for the most part. The credit card. I mean, I think credit card interest rates have tended to go up. So I think my credit card now has something like a 21% interest rate. So it's just crazy to, if you can avoid to carry debt on a card, on something carrying that sort of interest rate. And I guess a lot of people have redraw facilities on for home loans and so forth, and perhaps it's just a reflection that our financial markets are creating products with with cheaper forms of debt that people are taking advantage of. Would be my.
Yes, it's certainly the case. Having moved to Australia 4 years ago, I will say that in other countries it is a lot easier to find credit cards outside of Australia with lower interest rates. Let me end with one more question. So one of the things that I know has been observed during this pandemic is that a lot of people, as they've been in lockdown and not being able to travel, have increased the ownership of pets. And I noticed that one of the chapters in the stat report was on pet ownership. So I was wondering if you have a 30-second synopsis of that chapter. And in particular, I was wondering if you looked at the role of pet ownership and your measures of well-being.
Yes, well, even before the pandemic, we had I think 62% of households people owned a pet, so it was already pretty widespread. And don't know what it's gone up to this year, but yeah, we did look for whether we could find associations between measures of your well-being, like mental health and life satisfaction with pet ownership, and didn't really find much in the way of positive effects. And in fact, it looks like cats were a negative for your well-being. But that just shows you the pitfalls of making causal inferences from statistical correlations. Because I think if you look at a lot of cat owners, for example, they live alone, and that tends to lower well-being, for example, and so it's highly likely that if they didn't own a cat, their well-being would be even lower. So.
Okay, great. There is one last technical question. Oh, I just got a whole bunch of new questions, but we are running out of time. But the technical question is, what is the lowest level of geography for which you can use HILDA?
So there's two versions of the HILDA data. There's a general release, and then I've forgotten the name of the other one, but it's a less confidentialized release, which it certainly has postcode in it. I can't off the top of my head remember how detailed the locational information gets, because I rarely use it. I use the general release for the HILDA report. But there are tougher requirements that the government imposes in order to be able to access that less confidentialized data source, because of the concerns about confidentiality.
Okay, Great. So unfortunately, we're out of time. So let me thank you, Roger, and thank you, the audience. You've presented some great questions. For those of you with questions that we haven't been able to address online, we will be adding answers to the questions when we upload the recording. I hope that you've enjoyed this colloquium, and I look forward to seeing you at our next and what will be the final colloquium for 2020. This is going to be held next Tuesday on December 8th, where I and Dr. Maxime Anyev will be presenting the next Breaking Down Barriers report. The report is going to be released on Monday, so you have time to read the report before attending the colloquium. The report will focus on the time-varying dimensions of individual poverty in Australia. The Breaking Down Barriers report series is done in collaboration with the Paul Ramsay Foundation. Please register for this next colloquium by following the link that has just been posted in the chat function and posted next to the live stream on Slido. Again, thank you for attending this colloquium, and thank you, Roger.